this fall, and that once we do, my prediction is, since we were actually making progress to get out of this thing that we were stuck in, we're going to get out. So I wouldn't write off Spirit yet. I think we're going to hear from it again, and I think it's going to continue to do good things. Now, on the other side of the planet, Opportunity has been its charmed sister. Opportunity has had almost nothing go wrong with it since day one of the mission. Spirit has had a broken wheel that it now has to drag when it drives. Nothing like that has happened to Opportunity. There's been issues with more dust in Spirit's case on the solar panels. Nothing like that with Opportunity. So Opportunity, because it's near the equator, because it hasn't had these other issues, has actually been perking along, and we plan it every day. In fact, as I said earlier when we were talking about communicating with the rovers, there is planning going on today, although we're not doing much, because another spacecraft that we rely upon, Odyssey, is in safe mode, so we can't get data back. So we hear from the rover. It's very interesting. What they do is there's something called a beep, and it's literally that. It's a radio signal that we get that responds at a certain time, and by doing so, tells us if the rover got our commands on board. So what it'll do is, let's say yesterday we loaded commands to the rover and we told it to beep at 11 o'clock. Today when we load the commands, we'll tell it to beep at 11:02. So we listen at 11, no beep. Listen at 11:02, got the beep, it got our commands. So we can do that with a beep. That's a simplistic way of describing it, but it literally works. So even though we're not getting a lot of data back from the rover, because Odyssey's in safe mode, we are getting enough to know that it is getting our commands and it is doing what we tell it to do. Now we have to be very careful, because just like the cameras that I see everybody has here with your flash cards in them, 1 gigabyte flash cards, that's about, well actually we have less than that. You guys have, who has a, thank you Zabi, you're the man. Always, you and Dave are always the man. Thank you, sir. How many people have digital cameras? How big is your flash card? 2 gigabytes or bits? Bytes, right? How big is yours?
8.
8 gigabytes? Guess how big the flash memory on the rovers is? About 1.2 gigabits. Okay, there's 8 bits in a byte. Okay, so divide a gigabyte by 8. Gigabit by 8 to get how many bytes it is. It's what, 16 megabytes? Something like that? Okay, so we deal with that. Now, an image, just like your images, the PanCam images, take basically 20/20 quality images in 13 different filters. So you take a picture right now and you figure out how big it is, or when you download it to your computer, it's megabytes. A typical PanCam image for us is on order, depending on how many filters we use, on order of about 30, 40, sometimes as high as 45 megabytes. So you can see that without any downlink, or only very little downlink, we have to be extremely careful, because as soon as we fill our flash cards, just like it does with your cameras, you start deleting what you took. And if what you're deleting is the information you need to be able to drive, then you got to redo all that. So we have to be very careful not to fill up our flash. So today, for example, we had a very light planning session. We're going to do something called a systematic foreground, which is something we do every so often when we drive, to look at the ground in front of us, just so we can see how things are changing as we move across the landscape. Where Opportunity is, it's a very, very flat surface. It makes this table look like the Himalayas. It's got a whole bunch of little ripples on it, and actually if you just kind of glance at it, it almost looks like you're traversing like a ship on the ocean, or a ship on a lake. But it's relatively easy driving, so long as we avoid big ripples that we can get stuck in. Do you remember what was is? What you gonna ask?
Really good. You know that thing that looks almost like a face on Mars?
There's a thing called the face on Mars, which is not really a face. And let's see if I have something in my pocket. Anybody have a state quarter from New Hampshire on it? Anybody ever been to Franconia Notch in New Hampshire? Okay, so, well, most of you have seen the state quarter from New Hampshire. It's got a picture of a face. It's called the Old Man in the Mountain. It doesn't exist anymore. She's been there. It fell down. And I grew up in northern New York State, in the White Mountains in New Hampshire and Maine is where we went camping. And I remember driving up through Franconia Notch, and that was the big thing. You knew you were getting close to the campsite, When you came around the corner and suddenly this cliff in front of you, which looked just like a cliff in front of you, as you came around the corner, the light would catch it just right, the profile was just like, and voila, you know, there was like this sort of Abe Lincoln, why did I say Abraham? Abe Lincoln-esque face on the top of this cliff. And then you kept driving and it just started to look like a cliff again. But that's when you knew you were getting close. That's what's on the back of the New Hampshire State Quarter. Well, a few years ago, it all fell down and the Old Man in the Mountain doesn't exist anymore. My point was, there was no face up there on top of the cliff. It was just as you drove around and looked from the right angle, the way the light would shine on it, it looked like a profile of a man's face, kind of like Abe Lincoln. Well, the thing on Mars is exactly the same thing. There are some places in the northern hemisphere of Mars where there's a bunch of mounds on the surface. And one of those mounds in particular was imaged way back by the Viking spacecraft at apparently the right time of the afternoon, which was when the orbiters from Viking went over, and the shadows that were cast made it look something like a face. Now that thing has been imaged out the wazoo by Mars Global Surveyor, Odyssey, and now Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter since then. Every geologist I know never thought it was anything other than just sort of the way the light was shining on it. And in fact, because we've imaged it now many different times a day, it doesn't look anything like a face. It's just a rock formation. So you're right. You're exactly right. There's something on Mars called the face on Mars, and it's like this thing that used to be in New Hampshire called the Old Man in the Mountain. And it was just sort of an arrangement, a random arrangement of rocks that when the light's shone on it just right, happened to look like a face. So if I take my hands in the light, you know, and I can make like a rabbit or a dog, it's that kind of thing. It's the shadows are cast to make it look like something that it's not. Yeah. Oh yeah. Details. Okay, so let's see. So this is what they look like. This is the real flight article. Some of you can't see this, so I'll turn it a little bit, and I'll probably knock the whole thing down, and this will be bad. Well, these folks can't see it, so I think you guys can start to see it now. So this is the real article. This is down in Florida. I'm on the science team, so the guy that I work for is a member of the science team. Is actually the head of the science team, Steve Squires. That's him there. This is his sort of baby. He's the principal investigator. And Steve and myself and about 7 or 8 other people are what we call Science Operations Working Group chairs. So we take turns leading the discussion of what you're going to do with the rovers on any given day. I did it last week, and I'm supposed to do it 2 days next week, but I just got out of it because it turns out that our planning relative to what time it is on Mars happens too late on the East Coast, and I got kids at home. So somebody on the West Coast is actually going to take over for me and do it next week. But we take turns, because if you did it every single day, you kind of burn out. And you start to get a little complacent and maybe a little bit lackadaisical. You need to be safe. You need to be sharp, because one mistake with a piece of hardware can actually ruin the rover. So what we do is we sit down. We used to be out at the Jet Propulsion Lab. We used to live and work out there. And actually for the first 3 months of the mission, we used to live on Mars time. And what that means is Mars's day is about 40 minutes longer than an Earth day. So every day we would start our day 40 minutes later, which meant over the course of about 2 weeks we would cycle through an Earth day. So the beginning of the first week I would get up at 8 a.m. By the end of the first week I'd be getting up at 8 p.m. And by the end of the second week I'd be getting up at 8 a.m. again. That got real old for a couple of reasons. First of all, my house and family was on the East Coast and I was out there. And I was waking up when it was 3 o'clock in the morning here. The other thing is, it may surprise you to know, it surprised me, is in Pasadena there's very few 24-hour anythings. So supermarkets, restaurants, anything. You couldn't buy food, you couldn't go out and get something to eat. So it got kind of old after the first couple of months, and I'll say the novelty. As you do anything after a while, a certain level of routine sets in.